There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't announce itself with drama or closure. It lives in the space between hope and reality, in the quiet moments when you check your phone knowing there won't be a message, in the careful way you measure your words so you don't ask for too much, in the exhausting mental gymnastics of convincing yourself that breadcrumbs are enough. You love someone who cannot love you back, not because they're cruel, but because something in them is unavailable, unwilling, or simply incapable of meeting you where you are. And the strangest part is that you know this. You've always known this. Yet you stay anyway, orbiting around their inconsistency like a planet that can't break free from a dying star's gravity. If you've ever loved someone like this, then you understand that it's not about logic. It's not about what makes sense or what you deserve or what anyone else can see from the outside. It's about something far more complex, something woven into the architecture of how you learn to love in the first place. Because the psychology of loving people who can't love you back isn't just about the other person. It's about you, your history, your patterns, and the silent agreements you made with yourself long before you ever met them. Let's start with what's actually happening beneath the surface, because this kind of love doesn't begin when you meet someone emotionally unavailable. It begins much earlier, often in childhood, when you first learned what love looked like. Psychologists have identified something called attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, which maps how early relationships with caregivers shape our adult patterns of connection. If you grew up with consistent, responsive love, you likely developed what's called secure attachment. You learned that love is safe, that people stay, that your needs matter. But if your early experiences were inconsistent, if love came with conditions, if affection was withheld or unpredictable, then your nervous system learned something different. It learned that love is something you have to earn, chase, or wait for. It learned that absence and presence can coexist. It learned that wanting someone and having them are two different things. This creates what psychologists call anxious attachment, or sometimes anxious preoccupied attachment. People with this pattern often didn't receive consistent emotional availability as children, though temperament and later relationships can also shape this response. They developed a hypervigilance around connection. They learned to monitor for signs of withdrawal. They learned to overcompensate with care and attention. They learned to tolerate emotional ambiguity because at least ambiguity meant the person was still there, even if only partially. And here's the pattern that follows them into adulthood. They are drawn to people who replicate that original dynamic, not consciously, but instinctively. Because even though it hurts, it feels familiar. And to the nervous system, familiarity often feels safer than the unknown, even when the unknown might actually be healthier. When you love someone who can't love you back, your brain is often trying to resolve an old wound. It's attempting to prove that this time, if you're patient enough, understanding enough, supportive enough, they will finally choose you fully. It's the psychological equivalent of returning to a puzzle you never solved, convinced that this time you'll find the missing piece. Therapists call this repetition compulsion, a term coined by Sigmund Freud to describe how people unconsciously recreate painful experiences from their past in an attempt to master them. You're not choosing unavailable people because you enjoy suffering. You're choosing them because some part of you believes that if you can make this person stay, if you can make this person love you, then you'll finally heal the original abandonment or inconsistency you experienced earlier in life. But here's what makes this pattern so psychologically complex. The person you're loving isn't necessarily a villain. They might be kind, charming, thoughtful in moments. They might genuinely care about you in whatever capacity they're capable of. They might even say they love you, and maybe they do in their own limited way. The problem isn't that they're monsters. The problem is that their capacity for emotional availability doesn't match your need for consistency. And this mismatch creates a unique kind of suffering because there's no clear enemy to fight against. You can't hate them. You can't blame them entirely. You can only sit in the confusion of loving someone who gives you just enough to keep you hoping, but never enough to feel secure. This is where something called intermittent reinforcement comes into play. It's a concept from behavioral psychology that explains why inconsistent rewards are more addictive than consistent ones. If someone always responds to you, your brain adjusts and expects it. If someone never responds, you eventually give up. But if someone responds sometimes, unpredictably, your brain becomes obsessed with figuring out the pattern. You analyze every interaction. You replay conversations. You search for clues. You convince yourself that if you just behave correctly, if you just say the right thing, if you just give them space, or don't give them space, or show up differently, then you'll unlock the consistency you crave. Slot machines work on this principle. So do emotionally unavailable people, not because they're all manipulative, though some are, but because their inconsistency creates a neurological response in you that mimics addiction. If this is hitting uncomfortably close, stay with me. The next part explains why your mind defends the very pattern that's hurting you. You become addicted to the potential of who they could be, not the reality of who they are. You fall in love with glimpses, with moments of warmth that feel so profound precisely because they're so rare. When someone who is usually distant suddenly opens up, even briefly, it creates an emotional high that floods your system with dopamine and oxytocin. Your brain registers that moment as proof the connection is possible, that if you just keep trying, more moments like that will come. But they don't come consistently, and the gap between those moments becomes a space you fill with hope, with justification, with reinterpretation of their behavior that protects you from accepting the truth, which is that they are showing you exactly who they are through their pattern of absence, not through their occasional presence. People who love those who can't love them back often develop what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. This is the mental discomfort that occurs when your beliefs don't align with reality. You believe you deserve love, yet you're accepting scraps. You know they're not showing up, yet you defend their behavior. You recognize the pattern is painful, yet you stay. To resolve this dissonance, your mind performs impressive mental gymnastics. You tell yourself they're just scared of intimacy. You tell yourself they've been hurt before. You tell yourself they need time. You tell yourself that your love, if patient and unconditional enough, will eventually heal them. And maybe some of that is true. Maybe they are scared. Maybe they have been hurt. But the question isn't whether their emotional unavailability has a reason. The question is whether their reason justifies your suffering. This is where many people get stuck, because they mistake understanding someone's wounds for accepting mistreatment. Compassion is important. Empathy is valuable. But neither should require you to abandon your own needs indefinitely. Yet people who love unavailable partners often have a high tolerance for emotional neglect, not because they lack self-worth in theory, but because their self-worth was conditioned early on to be tied to how much they could endure, how understanding they could be, how little they could need. If you learned as a child that your needs were inconvenient, or that love was something you had to earn through exceptional behavior, then as an adult, you'll unconsciously seek relationships that reinforce that belief. You'll be drawn to people who make you prove your worth through patience and sacrifice. There's also a profound loneliness in this dynamic that often goes unspoken. You're in a relationship, or something resembling one, yet you feel utterly alone. You can't fully confide in friends because explaining the situation makes it sound simpler than it feels. They'll ask why you don't just leave. They'll point out the obvious red flags. And you'll feel defensive because they don't understand that leaving isn't the hard part. The hard part is accepting that the person you love doesn't have the capacity to love you the way you need, even if they wanted to. The hard part is grieving someone who's still alive, still in your life, still occasionally warm. The hard part is recognizing that you're mourning not just the relationship as it is, but the relationship as you hoped it would become. This kind of love also messes with your perception of time. Days feel longer when you're waiting for a text. Hours disappear when you're together. Your brain gets trapped in a cycle of anticipation and disappointment that distorts your sense of presence. You're never fully in the moment because part of you is always bracing for the next withdrawal or analyzing the last interaction. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, and it's exhausting. Your nervous system is in a constant state of activation, scanning for threats to the connection, preparing for abandonment, even during moments of closeness. This is why people in these dynamics often feel tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. It's not physical exhaustion. It's the exhaustion of carrying an entire relationship emotionally by yourself while pretending it's mutual. Here's the part nobody prepares you for. One of the most painful aspects of loving someone who can't love you back is the way it erodes your sense of self over time. You start small, making accommodations that seem reasonable. You don't ask for too much. You give them space when they need it. You accept their boundaries, even when those boundaries feel like rejection. But gradually, you shrink. You stop voicing your needs because you've learned they create distance. You stop expecting consistency because disappointment is harder than lowered expectations. You become a version of yourself that's easier to love for someone who struggles to love at all, which means you become less of yourself. And the tragedy is that you do this consciously, believing that if you just make yourself small enough, easy enough, undemanding enough, they'll finally have room to love you. But it doesn't work that way, because the issue was never that you were too much. The issue was always that they didn't have enough to give. This dynamic also creates a distorted narrative about what love means. If you've spent years loving someone who can't reciprocate fully, you might internalize the belief that love is supposed to hurt, that it's supposed to require constant effort, that it's supposed to feel like you're fighting for someone's attention. You might start to equate intensity with depth, confusing the anxiety of uncertainty with the passion of genuine connection. And this belief system can follow you into future relationships. Even when you meet someone who is available, who is consistent, who wants to show up for you, it might feel boring or uncomfortable because your nervous system has been trained to associate love with longing, not with peace. This might sound familiar because this pattern keeps showing up in different forms. There's a concept in psychology called trauma bonding, which describes the intense attachment that forms in relationships characterized by intermittent abuse and affection. While not every emotionally unavailable relationship involves abuse, many share the same intermittent reinforcement pattern. The bond you feel isn't just love. It's also the neurological wiring that happens when your brain experiences cycles of stress and relief. Each time they pull away and then come back, your body floods with relief hormones. Each time they're cold and then suddenly warm, your system registers it as a reward. Over time, your attachment to them becomes partially about the biochemical cycle itself, not just the person. This is why leaving someone who can't love you back often feels harder than leaving someone who is consistently unkind. Consistent unkindness allows your brain to categorize the relationship as unsafe. Inconsistent love keeps your brain hopeful, keeps it engaged in the pattern, keeps it searching for the next reward. Many people in these dynamics also struggle with something psychologists call limerence, a term coined by psychologist Dorothy Tenoff to describe an involuntary state of intense romantic desire. Limerence is characterized by intrusive thoughts about the person, fear of rejection, physical symptoms of anxiety, and an overwhelming focus on interpreting their behavior. It's not quite the same as love, though it often masquerades as it. Limerence thrives on uncertainty. It thrives on barriers to union. It thrives on the fantasy of what could be rather than the reality of what is. And emotionally unavailable people, because they create natural barriers and uncertainty, often trigger intense limerence in those who are attachment anxious. The longing becomes consuming, not because the relationship is particularly fulfilling, but because the lack of resolution keeps your mind obsessively engaged. There's also a deep shame that accompanies this pattern, a shame that many people never voice. You feel ashamed that you can't just leave. You feel ashamed that you're smart, capable, and self-aware in every other area of your life, yet you can't seem to break free from this one person. You feel ashamed when you recognize the pattern, promise yourself you'll do better, and then find yourself right back in the cycle the moment they show you the smallest bit of warmth. This shame compounds the isolation because you stop talking about it honestly. You minimize it to others. You rationalize it to yourself. And in that silence, the pattern deepens because there's no external reality check, no voice reminding you that you deserve more than waiting and hoping and interpreting silence as potential love. But here's something crucial that often gets overlooked in discussions about emotionally unavailable relationships. Sometimes the person you love isn't intentionally withholding. Sometimes they're genuinely struggling with their own capacity for intimacy, often due to their own attachment wounds, past trauma, or fear of vulnerability. Understanding this doesn't mean you should stay, but it does mean that the narrative isn't always about someone choosing not to love you. Sometimes it's about someone who doesn't know how to love anyone, including themselves, in a way that feels safe or sustainable. Their unavailability is about their relationship with intimacy, not about your worthiness of love. This distinction matters because many people internalize emotional unavailability as evidence that they're unlovable, when in reality, they're simply trying to be loved by someone who hasn't yet learned how to love openly. This is where most people misunderstand themselves. There's also the question of why you stay, which is more layered than most people acknowledge. Yes, there's the attachment pattern. Yes, there's the hope. But there's often something else too, a fear of facing the emptiness that will come if you let go. When you've organized your emotional life around someone, when you spent months or years waiting, hoping, and trying, the thought of walking away means confronting not just the loss of them, but the loss of all that time and effort. It means admitting that the story you've been telling yourself about eventual reciprocation might not come true. It means sitting with the grief of what never was and what will never be. And sometimes, staying in the painful familiarity feels easier than facing that void, even though the void is actually where healing begins. Another psychological element at play is something called the sunk cost fallacy, a cognitive bias where people continue investing in something because of how much they've already invested, even when continuing causes more harm than benefit. You've given so much, emotionally, mentally, sometimes financially or practically. You've been patient, you've been understanding, you've adjusted your expectations, and the idea of walking away now feels like admitting that all of that was wasted. But here's the truth that's hard to hear. The time and energy you've already spent cannot be recovered by spending more. The investment doesn't become worthwhile just because you keep investing. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is recognize that continuing forward with someone who can't meet you is actually the greater loss, not walking away. The healing process from this kind of love is not straightforward. It doesn't follow a neat timeline or a checklist of steps. It requires you to do something that feels counterintuitive, which is to grieve someone who's still alive and possibly still in your life in some diminished capacity. You have to mourn the future you imagined with them. You have to mourn the version of them you fell in love with, the one who showed up in those rare moments of openness. You have to mourn the part of yourself that believed your love could fix or change or heal them. And you have to sit with the uncomfortable truth that love, no matter how genuine or deep, is not always enough to sustain a relationship. Sometimes love exists and the relationship still doesn't work, not because the love wasn't real, but because one person's capacity couldn't match the other's need. Part of healing also involves examining your own role in the pattern, not to blame yourself, but to understand what drew you to unavailability in the first place. What did this dynamic give you? Did it allow you to avoid your own fear of true intimacy by staying with someone who would never fully claim you? Did it protect you from the vulnerability of being seen completely because you were always focused on getting them to see you? Did it give you a sense of purpose, a project, someone to fix or save, which distracted you from addressing your own wounds? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary, because until you understand what you are seeking in the unavailability itself, you risk repeating the pattern with someone new who simply wears a different face but offers the same emotional distance. You also have to learn, slowly and with great difficulty, that closure doesn't always come from the other person. You won't always get the conversation where they admit they couldn't show up. You won't always receive the apology or acknowledgement you deserve. You won't always understand why they gave you just enough to stay, but never enough to feel secure. And waiting for that closure from them keeps you tethered to the dynamic. Real closure comes from within. It comes from deciding that your peace matters more than their validation. It comes from choosing to stop waiting for them to give you permission to move on. It comes from recognizing that you can love someone and still leave, that you can understand their wounds and still honor your own. There's a particular kind of strength required to walk away from someone you still love. And it's a strength that often goes unrecognized. People will say, "You should have left earlier." They'll wonder why it took so long. But they don't understand the internal battle that happens every single day when you're trying to detach from someone who once made you feel seen, even if only briefly. They don't understand the grief of closing a door on possibility, even when that possibility was always more fantasy than reality. They don't understand that leaving isn't about not loving them anymore. It's about finally loving yourself enough to stop accepting less than you need. And maybe the most important truth to understand is this: you are not broken for having loved someone who couldn't love you back. Your capacity to love deeply, even in the face of inconsistency, even when it hurt, speaks to the strength of your heart, not its weakness. The problem was never your love. The problem was the mismatch. The problem was trying to build a home in someone who was still a construction site. And now, as you begin to step back, as you start to reclaim the energy you've poured into someone else's emotional unavailability, you get to ask yourself a new question. What would it feel like to direct that depth of care towards someone who can actually hold it? What would it feel like to be loved as consistently as you've been loving? What would it feel like to stop translating someone's actions into proof of affection and instead experience affection that speaks for itself? You might not have those answers yet. You might not even believe such love is possible after everything you've been through. But it is. Not because emotionally available people are perfect, or because relationships without difficulty exist, but because there's a fundamental difference between a relationship where someone is trying and struggling versus one where someone isn't trying at all, but keeps you close enough that you can't fully let go. You deserve someone who is trying, even imperfectly. You deserve someone whose love doesn't require you to become a detective, analyzing every text and gesture for hidden meaning. You deserve someone who makes you feel chosen, not tolerated. And walking toward that future means walking away from people who taught you that love means waiting in the dark, hoping they'll eventually turn on the light. So if you're someone who has loved people who couldn't love you back, know this: every moment you spent hoping wasn't wasted, even though it hurt. It taught you about your own capacity for devotion. It taught you about your resilience. It taught you what you don't want in your next relationship. And now, it's teaching you something even more valuable: that the most radical act of love you can perform is not continuing to pour yourself into someone else's emptiness. It's turning that love inward, letting it fill your own cracks, letting it remind you that you were whole before them and you'll be whole after them. You just have to be brave enough to stop waiting for someone else to make you feel complete and start believing that you already are.